In the modern world, we describe economic collapses with ornate words almost as if it were the end of the world. Crisis. Stock market graphs turning red on screens, panicking investors, and headlines screaming, "The market has collapsed." It is all presented as if everything happened suddenly that very morning, like a storm that comes out of nowhere and crashes down. But when you look carefully at history, especially the history of money and human psychology, crises rarely begin suddenly. That great collapse moment is not the beginning of the disease, but its time of death. Most of the time, the decay begins much earlier, in a quiet moment when no one is looking at bank accounts or gold reserves, where trust is broken. When the origins of economic thought are discussed, modern education systems teach us to memorize certain names: Adam Smith with the invisible hand, Karl Marx with class conflict, or Aristotle who laid out the logic of barter. These names are, of course, important. Yet in Western historical narratives, there is another voice that has been confined to footnotes for centuries, silenced either consciously or unconsciously. 7 centuries before Adam Smith, long before the idea of capitalism had even been articulated, when central banks and digital financial instruments were beyond imagination, a Muslim thinker issued a deeply unsettling warning about money. What he said was not a simple technical market analysis. He argued that the moment money loses its moral compass, societies begin to rot from the inside, like a cancerous cell. When we look at our world today, where algorithms rule and billions of dollars change hands every second, the relevance of this 1,000-year-old warning can be deeply unsettling. Welcome to this discussion at the intersection of money, power, and belief. Here, economics is not just about numbers, and history shows us that nothing is ever as simple as it seems. To truly understand this story and the danger approaching, we must rewind time to around the year 1100. First, let us look at Europe. At that time, Europe had long since consumed the glorious legacy of Rome and was wandering through the dark and uneven paths of feudalism. Cities were small, trade was local, and literacy was nearly non-existent. Kings and feudal lords fought endless wars over small patches of land. Now let us look eastward. The Islamic world had established the most vibrant economic network the world had ever seen up to that point, stretching from the elegant palaces of Al-Andalus to the steppes of Central Asia. Baghdad, Damascus, Cairo, and Cordoba were not merely crowded cities. They were the heart, and center of global trade and intellectual production. Caravans arriving from the dusty roads of the Silk Road carried not only Chinese silk or Indian spices, they also transported letters of credit, check-like payment orders, and complex partnership contracts. In the markets of Baghdad, a merchant could pay his partner in Damascus using nothing more than a piece of paper. The financial system was astonishingly modern and fast. Wealth was growing rapidly. The merchant class was becoming richer, and state treasuries were overflowing. Yet every bright era has its shadow. No one could fully grasp what this dizzying system would cost the soul of society. As wealth increased, moral boundaries became just as blurred. It is precisely in this environment that Abu Hamid Al-Ghazali enters the stage. He was not an ordinary religious figure. He was one of the brightest minds of his era, a jurist, a philosopher, and at the same time a sharp social critic. As the chief professor of the Nizamiya madrasas in Baghdad, he held a position comparable to, and even more influential than, today's rectors of Harvard or Oxford. Sultans sought his counsel, merchants awaited his legal opinions. He was at the peak of his career, and yet it was at this very peak that something inside Ghazali broke. He realized that there was a deep flaw in the way the system functioned. Markets were expanding, buildings were rising, people were wearing more expensive clothes, but meaning was falling behind. In the crowds of the cities, he saw an immense spiritual loneliness. This inner crisis shook him so deeply that he abandoned everything: his position, his fame, his wealth, and withdrew into an isolation that would last for years. This withdrawal was not an escape, but a search. The question Ghazali asked was simple, yet its answer was dangerous. What happens to a society that becomes rich without becoming wise? In seeking an answer, he turned his focus to money itself, the very heart of the economy. And here it becomes clear how mistaken it is to label him merely as an old religious scholar. Ghazali did not analyze money through mathematical equations or supply-demand graphs like modern economists. He approached money as a psychological and sociological phenomenon, making him in many ways one of the earliest representatives of what we now call behavioral economics. Centuries earlier, Aristotle had defined money as a practical medium of exchange. Modern economics views it as a store of value. Ghazali, however, looked at it from a far more nuanced, almost poetic, yet deeply analytical perspective. How does money change human behavior? How does it shape trust? And most importantly, how does it transform societies when it is misused? To him, money was never something to be worshipped. It was not an end, but merely a means. To explain this, he used one of the most elegant metaphors in the history of economic thought. Money is like a mirror. Think about it. A mirror has no color of its own. It has no image or shape by itself, yet it reflects everything placed before it. The value of a mirror lies not in its existence, but in its ability to reveal what stands in front of it. Money is the same. Whether it is gold, silver, or paper does not matter. Its sole function is to reflect the value people produce and to enable exchange and cooperation. If you try to eat the mirror, you will starve. If you lock it away in a room, it becomes useless. Ghazali's metaphor is not merely philosophical rhetoric. It is a sharp economic critique and a powerful high-meaning analogy for money. From this perspective emerges one of his harshest and most relevant criticisms today: hoarding, or as he called it, imprisoning money. According to Ghazali, wealth locked away in chests, under pillows, or in today's terms, idle accounts, is not merely inactive, it actively harms society. Why? He compares this to blood circulation in the human body. The purpose of blood is to flow through the veins and deliver oxygen to the cells. If blood pools in one place and stops flowing, we do not call it wealth. In medicine, we call it a clot. And if left untreated, a clot kills the organ. When money stops circulating, labor goes unrewarded. A farmer cannot sell his produce. A craftsman cannot earn the value of his work. Trade slows, markets shrink. People grow poorer despite the absence of real scarcity. The problem is not that flour or water has run out. It is that the mechanism that delivers them to people, money, has been locked up. At this point, Ghazali's target is not merely stingy individuals, but the system itself. When the wealthy withdraw money from circulation out of fear or greed, artificial scarcity emerges, prices become distorted, trust erodes, and the heaviest cost of this crisis is always paid by those with the least, by the most vulnerable. But Ghazali's warning does not end here. His next stop is one of the most controversial issues in modern finance: speculation. Ghazali harshly condemns merchants who profit from crises, manipulate prices, and create artificial shortages by claiming goods are unavailable while stockpiling them in warehouses. He treats concepts like hoarding and usury not merely as religious prohibitions, but as economic crimes. To him, such gains are based not on production, but on exploitation. When someone grows wheat in a field and sells it, value is created. But when someone buys up that wheat, hoards it, while people starve, and sells it only when prices rise tenfold, this is not trade. Ghazali calls this corruption. One who profits from the harm of others, he says, profits only from corruption. And corruption never stays where it begins. This moral decay, starting in a merchant's warehouse, spreads to markets, then to courts, institutions, and eventually to the entire society. What we now call financial bubbles, predatory lending, or crisis profiteering is an early diagnosis of this phenomenon from 1,000 years ago. At this point, we can open a parenthesis and voice a counter-argument. But isn't this how the free market works? If everyone doesn't chase profit, how can the economy grow? Ghazali was not anti-profit or anti-trade. On the contrary, he believed trade was the lifeblood of society and that wealth creation was legitimate. He even argued that merchants should be praised for their courage and willingness to take risks. The line he drew was at honesty and transparency. False weights, hidden defects, sales made by withholding information. According to him, markets do not function through mathematical rules alone, but through trust between participants. In modern terms, we call this social capital. For Ghazali, once trust collapses, even the most perfect contracts become nothing more than pieces of paper. Another vital emphasis of his was the value of labor. Ghazali drew attention to the psychological destructiveness of easy money. Wealth earned through effort, he argued, builds the individual and strengthens character. Wealth gained through manipulation, gambling, or usury, on the other hand, corrodes its owner. This may sound like a moral sermon, but its consequences are highly practical. Societies in which a class emerges that consumes without producing eventually become lazy, lose their skills, and grow dependent on others. History is filled with the ruins of empires that followed this path. Ghazali's critiques did not stop with the merchants and the marketplace. He aimed his arrows at the very top, the state and the palace, especially regarding monetary policy. When sultans and rulers faced budget deficits due to wars or extravagant lifestyles, they often resorted to a subtle tactic, reducing the gold or silver content of coins. In other words, secretly devaluing money. While people believed their money retained its value, their wealth was in fact evaporating. Ghazali explicitly called this practice theft. It is no different, he said, from a ruler reaching into the pockets of his own people. Because it is a hidden and non-consensual tax, this was inflation by another name, and Ghazali clearly saw its consequences. Such manipulation hits fixed income earners and the poor the hardest. The wealthy can protect themselves by converting assets, but the purchasing power of ordinary people evaporates. Worse still, trust in the state fractures at its core. The state has a duty to protect the market, Ghazali argued, but no right to manipulate it. To him, an unjust ruler who tampers with money destroys prosperity faster and more permanently than any external enemy. An enemy may tear down walls. Bad economic policy tears down a society's faith in the future. When we look at history through a broad lens, we see how accurate this warning was. Ghazali predicted that states which constantly tamper with currency would eventually lose the trust of their people entirely. People abandon local money and turn to barter or more reliable foreign currencies. This scenario played out centuries later in Weimar Germany, when people carried wheelbarrows of cash to buy a loaf of bread. In Zimbabwe, when trillion-dollar banknotes were discarded on the streets, and in Venezuela. The mechanisms change, but human behavior and the logic of collapse remain the same. Perhaps Ghazali's deepest and most thought-provoking insight is this: money is not a technical tool, it is a collective belief. The value of paper money, digital numbers, or gold coins exists only because we believe in it. When people stop believing in that shared story, even the most complex financial systems and the largest banks collapse like houses of cards overnight. The fall of Lehman Brothers in 2008 did not happen because money ran out, but because belief did. In the end, Ghazali's conclusion is clear. A society can endure poverty, hardship, and scarcity. History is full of such examples. But a society cannot survive for long with corruption, distrust, and injustice. Economies collapse not because resources are depleted, but because people lose trust in each other and in the system. What holds a system together is not mathematical formulas, but that invisible bond of trust. Today, when we look into the mirror Ghazali held up 1,000 years ago, what do we see? A picture of extreme wealth inequality, speculation rewarding more than production, and trust in institutions and in one another at historic lows. Money moves at the speed of light through fiber optic cables, but meaning lags behind. The truth Ghazali wrote in Baghdad 1,000 years ago still holds. When money becomes detached from morality, the system eventually breaks. What you have heard is not merely a history lesson pulled from dusty shelves. It is a warning about the future. And while history may not repeat itself event by event, it always punishes those who ignore its laws and warnings in the same way, through crises and collapses. If this perspective has opened a new window for you on economics and the world we live in, don't forget to subscribe to continue exploring the stories beyond money. Because understanding is the first step toward freedom. Stay with us on Historic Talks.